Africa. Kalle udu si hai. Samaya do ipatla sabo pino. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Education Ploy, Spent Airlines and Environmental Restoration episode of Ubuntu Nomics podcast. This week, we'll be looking at the Basic Education Employment Initiative 2, the SAA-KQ Partnership, the TRIPS Waiver and Vaccinations, and the SIU Report on Digital Vibes. And in the Africa Regional Update, we'll be looking at Professor Kiprona versus the Attorney General of Kenya, women's political participation in Somalia, the review of forest and landscape restorations in Africa 2021 report, and the Eastern Regional Co-ordination Center in Kenya. And I want to take a moment to invite those of you listening to the podcast on YouTube to subscribe. And if you like this episode, feel free to hit the like button. And with me this week is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello, Sbu. How are you doing this week?
Hi, Sia. I'm well, thank you, man. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. It's been another bumper week, and I'll get us started with the essay update this week. Our first story is Basic Education Employment Initiative Phase 2. The Department of Basic Education, DBE, announced the opening of recruitment for Phase 2 of its Basic Education Employment Initiative, the BEEI. Applications are open from the 27th of September until the 3rd of October, and the DBE plans to employ 287,000 young people between the ages of 18 and 35. And those who are not studying, not receiving any form of government grant, will be eligible for these positions, and successful candidates will be placed in schools for 5 months from the 1st of November until 31st March 2022. They will either be placed as one of the 192,000 education assistants or as one of the 95,000 general school assistants. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one? And I think you raised some pertinent questions that I also had rummaging in my mind about this story.
Well, my first reaction was elation. I was really happy. But that turned to disappointment when I saw the contract period of 5 months. I began to have skeptical questions. Why employ them at this time, really? Is it political play? Since we're getting towards local government elections, what is the real intention? What will the assistants be doing that requires such a short duration, after which period their services will no longer be required? I mean, those are the questions that ran through my mind. At first, I thought the government was taking up their responsibility and sort of like paving a way towards a national program of full employment. I mean, in most countries, the government, I'm talking about developed countries, the government is still the biggest employer. And it's not the other way around. It's not how our sectarian South African media narrates the entire thing. It's the government is usually the biggest employer. Period.
Sure.
I mean, yeah. I mean, in South Africa, 3.5 jobs out of 100 are government. And in places like the US, it's almost like 10, even though the US claims to have a small government. I mean, their government is like 20% of the entire economy, but still 10% of the people employed are by government, and we're sitting at something less than 4%.
So you're saying that, there is capacity for the state playing more of a role as an employer of last resort. From my view, I do think that this is quite a ploy. The 5 months thing is precisely what really shocked me as well. And obviously the most recent publications, obviously around the income that these young youth teachers are expected to earn, which is somewhere around 3.5 or 3.8 thousand rand per month after deductions for UIF. So it does post, quite a lucrative opportunity, particularly for those who were unemployed or who were graduates sitting at home with no jobs and might have also even dependent on the SRD grants. But my problem is that, firstly, the education system is defunct as it is. We really need a complete overhaul of our education system. And, setting standards as low as a pass rate of 30 or 33% is really a concern for me, firstly, beyond the other myriad of problems that the education system faces. So I don't think that simply adding more staff is going to resolve any of these issues, which need, concerted effort by government to fix them. The opponents of government as an employer would then say, government spending too much in terms of already in terms of its incentives. It's ineffective. Perhaps that money should be going towards the private sector to boost private sector activity and jobs. For me, it becomes a chicken and egg situation, particularly in a country like ours, where there's high levels of inequality, very low aggregate demand. So if you're going to be pumping in private sector needs profits, and demand is what drives those profits. If we're sitting in a situation as we are in the country, the private sector approach to job creation is not necessarily going to be a solution. So I do think that we need a two-pronged approach, and hence we're getting people raising discussions around whether or not it's time for basic income grant, because obviously, given the amount spent on industrial policy or even other forms of employment as a way to ensure, apart from the operations of government, but as a social economic policy. People say, it's much cheaper for government to just provide a basic income grant. And that is expected. But, again, that might be good to boost aggregate demand for a short term, but then you hit a plateau. And then there's no growth because you ultimately aren't innovating in the economy. And at the same time, you're not employing people to create the demand. So it's a difficult one, and I must say I'm not sure which side I'm on, but I do think that a two-pronged approach where government is making the right policy decisions to enable private sector growth and in transformation in the private sector growth as well, whilst also providing an employer of last resort, particularly given the capacity that you raised, that there's still capacity that we can employ more compared to other countries. For me, it is an opportunity that government should take advantage of.
Yep, yeah. I would have thought that maybe the government would think that it's something like we used to have these volunteer policemen. They would take youngsters. I thought maybe that could also be another, because South Africa is short of 100,000 policemen. So yeah, there are avenues that we could employ more. The government should be an employer of last resort.
For me, it's even in practical areas beyond just that. So for me, social services is a big area that we need to be employing. Social services is going to be critical to deal with the problem of gender-based violence in the country. And obviously, coming out of pandemic, public health is another big area. Apart from education, yes, there is a need in education, but for me, it seems that there are also other areas that government can be focusing on. But obviously, this story is more of, I would say, a political ploy, I guess, to garner votes, and it's the same approach that government has been taking with the SRD grants, which I think were extended up until April next year. So they're taking a financial year approach view. And I think that's the problem of austerity, which has hamstrung government's ability to actually come up with long-term sustainable policies. And so now they're looking literally, to the next milestone. Quite a pity. But on that note, it brings us to our next story on the SA update, SAA and the KQ Partnership. South African Airways, SAA, signed a memorandum of cooperation with Kenya Airways, KQ, with the long-term aim of establishing a Pan-African airline group. The partnership is expected to enhance mutual growth potential by taking advantage of strengths of the two airlines' business hubs. Part of SAA's broader strategy is to become a major player in regional travel, and partnering with the KQ is expected to enable this by fostering exchange of expertise, innovation, best practice, and adopting local solutions. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
I hope that partnering in this highly competitive environment becomes the norm for SAA. This should also not uh, only be a Kenyan Airways deal. It should also incorporate West African airlines, which are currently dominated by French airlines, especially in Francophone Africa. Also, I saw that SAA followed this up with a similar partnership agreement with Emirates. But we should not only be looking at Kenyan Airways. We should get better partners, basically.
Sure. Look, I totally agree. And for me, Kenya Airways is probably among the worst possible airlines that SAA could partner with, especially from East Africa. It's so terrible. The service level, it's almost like another SAA, basically. So I worry that what you have in this instance are two spent airlines, or two spent swimmers, as it were, who are just going to drown each other. It would have been more, for me, strategic to partner with, up and coming airlines like Ethiopian Airlines, or, even Rwanda, for example. For me, and that to me would have been a much more strategic choice. The issue of West Africa, and it's sad because, as coming from Southern Africa, the only airline that's flying directly to West Africa is SAA. And there was a huge gap with SAA not being operational for the past few months, which has forced people to either have to, travel to West Africa via France or via Dubai, or even, in most instances, which was probably cheaper, via Addis and via Kigali. So you're going to East Africa before you go to West. It extends the journey and makes it 13 hours when it should just be 6 hours. So it was a terrible, terrible, terrible time. But obviously, given the lockdown, there wasn't a lot of sort of travel taking place anyway due to travel restrictions. But, in the absence of SAA, I would say a lot of business and even tourism travel between West Africa and South Africa, and Southern Africa generally, has definitely been hamstrung. So, yeah, I think this airline, and I think it's commendable that they are looking at a mixed bag of partnerships. I think the Emirates partnership, for me, makes more sense. But then again, we're not in the same kind of public sector or public financial environment, where the Emirates airline can get, more than adequate government subsidies from the Emirati government, or government of the UAE. SAA has had to beg and plead for government subsidies from South Africa, and at the same time has made very poor sort of commercial decisions, linked also to poor policy of partial privatizations that have sold the most profitable parts of the airline business. And they really have been sort of set up to fail. And this partnership, although is commendable amongst African airlines, and definitely I agree that the vision as forward looking as a Pan-African airline group is definitely something that we need to work towards. But obviously, I would have said a better partner would have been Rwanda, and particularly given President Kagame's alignment with this Pan-African airline view, which would ultimately make travel on the continent cheaper. For me, it seemed like that would have been a much better or more strategic decision to make. But in any case, we'll have to watch and see what this partnership yields.
Yep.
On that note, let's move on to our next story from the SA update from this week, and it's TRIPS waiver and vaccinations. President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the opening of the World Trade Organization WTO public forum, which considered the effects of the pandemic on trade and how a multilateral trading system can help build resilience to COVID-19 and future crises. Ramaphosa asserted that the time-bound trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights TRIPS waiver proposed by South Africa and India is urgent if the world is to save millions of lives, is urgently needed if the world is to save millions of lives. The president lamented the fact that less than 3% of adults are fully vaccinated in the low-income countries, compared to almost 60% in high-income countries. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
The way I see it is that Western countries are happy to pledge. They raise expectations and they get good PR at these summits, but they never live up to the whatever promises they make. And another tolerable inconvenience for them is to make donations. The US has once again promised 500 million jabs for the developing world. I do think they will honor this commitment, and that it will end there as aid or donations. I mean, President Ramaphosa is being too optimistic, in my view, thinking that the West or even our friends Russia and China will offer these waivers to intellectual property rights. I think that's stretching it a bit in my opinion. I mean, the world of global commerce is structured around these rights. Big global players, the way they see these IP, intellectual property, is that it equates to money or trade. It's not to be given away for free. They are always happy to offer these donations, give you aid, but not give you trade, not give you manufacturing capacity, because that's basically what Africa is looking for to produce our own. So they won't give. Like I'm saying, even Russia and China are not stepping in and saying, yeah, we are giving you we are waiving these IP rights. Yeah, that's how I see it. Yeah.
For me, this also raises the limits of government's ability to intervene in certain sectors. In as much as I'm not a pro-private sector, pro-neoliberal economics type of economist, I do think that certain sectors, particularly highly innovative sectors like these, particularly need private sector impetus and some level of government support, obviously, to manage the market, but other market failures involved. And the problem is that although there are rules in the WTO in terms of the relaxation, such as the waiver that is referred to here, or even the legislations around the use of generics during a pandemic and during a public health crisis that countries can actually apply for through the WTO, it seems to me that it's quite clear that there's, beyond just the business case for these private sector companies that have the intellectual property rights, there's a case that, there's definitely clearly an irrefutable case for waiving some property rights, particularly given the global nature of the pandemic and the fact that, there's no resolving this without equitable access for everyone on the planet in terms of vaccination in order to deal with the pandemic. So for me, it's a no-brainer from that perspective. It's just a pity that in most of these countries, the vaccines have been created through private sector partnerships with governments. And funny enough, there was a recent report by the Financial Times that highlighted some of the top 10 stocks that the US government has invested in. And in the top 5 is Pfizer as well as Johnson & Johnson. Because of the profitability linked to this, and what they were also expecting is to make profits on the back of the investments that they made in vaccines. Hence, they were able to secure 3 and 4 times their population in terms of doses, but at the same time also now have been hoarding. It's just almost a replication of national market dominance issues, that have an impact on food wastage and other things that destroy other ecosystems that could exist precisely because people have a dominant position in the market. So I don't know. From my point of view, there's these waivers in themselves are also not a panacea for the problem that African countries face themselves with. Ultimately, what we need to do is get a lot of investment in private sector or public investment, and in both, basically, in public health and in producing vaccines. Ultimately, we can't really, because basically now this waiver is a request for the kindness of those who own the intellectual property to allow you to produce in order to distribute locally. But for them, as you clearly highlighted, it's a profit motive, and it makes no sense.
Yes, I mean, in South Africa again, Aspen was funded by the PIC, and Aspen, their share price was going down. It was tanking before COVID-19, and when they got all those partnership agreements with Johnson and Johnson, it shot up. It was a lifeline for them. So this is the same whether you're talking Pfizer, you're talking Moderna. All of these companies were not being profitable for a long time, and so COVID-19 came, and they offered them a lifeline, basically.
Sure, definitely. And they haven't made waste of a good crisis in their sector, at least.
Exactly.
And that moves us to our last story in the SA update this week. SIU Report being finally released. President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa authorized the release of the final report of the Special Investigating Unit, the SIU, into the National Department of Health's award of a National Health Insurance (NHI) media campaign and subsequent COVID-19 communications to digital vibes. The SIU found that the procurement process in respect of the NHI and COVID-19 media campaigns were irregular, and the subsequent contracts were void. This has resulted in irregular expenditure of approximately 150 million rand, which is approximately $1 million, and fruitless and wasteful expenditure between 72 and 80 million rand, which is approximately just less than $500,000, which was incurred by the National Department of Health. The SIU evidence indicates that Dr. Anban Pillay, the Acting Director General of the NDOH, during the time should be criminally prosecuted for financial misconduct. And the SIU also found that the conduct of former Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, was improper, if not unlawful, as it constituted an interference by executive authority in the affairs of the administrative authority of the National Department of Health. Smoo, you had a point that you wanted to raise about this report and some of the findings.
Yeah. Well, the best part about this report, the best news, is that the SIU evidence indicates that Dr. Aban Pillay, the acting DDG, should be criminally prosecuted. I mean, that's that, and he is just about the only one that should be criminally prosecuted, and so this speaks to our previous episodes covering corruption by senior bureaucrats. My view is that we focus too much on politicians in this country for obvious reasons. Part of which is that this entrenches or validates a narrative. There is a lot of Afro-pessimism, and so politicians are the first, are always pointed at as being corrupt. So I'm not saying that they are not corrupt. They are corrupt. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is that officials, government officials, play a crucial role. It is my contention that we must weed out corrupt officials who are the real enablers of graft. I mean, without their complicity, there would be very little malfeasance. There's an old excuse about pressure being pressure from the politicians and being put on these officials to do wrong things. Now this no longer washes because the SIU have been uncovering a lot of evidence wherein officials, bureaucrats, are themselves very corrupt. In this case, in this instance, they are it's not stated here, but there are 7 officials who have been suspended by the Department of Health. 3 of them, when the story broke, they moved from Department of Health into other. They got either promotions or they went to other departments. So in total, there are 10 of them, 10 officials who should be suspended.
Yeah, for me, it's just another revelation in a series of revelations as to, how deep the malfeasance goes. And it's clearly not just politicians. Clearly, the government officials are themselves complicit in many cases. And not just, the senior officials, I would say all the way down, as we've seen in the state capture saga, that, all the way down to even clerks who process payments in the procurement departments of whatever department of government are also part of payrolls and payouts to facilitate the whole machinery. And yeah, it's sad, the extent, and we've seen multiple revelations of this as well, even in the corruption associated with the SRD grants, where you had even people who and the 350 SRD grants were going to people who were interns in government, who were earning at least 10 times that much on a monthly basis. So it's all over at multiple levels. And that note, that brings an end to our essay update this week. And at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to prompt our listeners who are watching on YouTube to hit the subscribe button. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to hit that like button. On that note, that takes us to the Africa Regional Update this week. Our first story in the Africa Regional Update is Kiprona versus the Attorney General of Kenya. The East African Court of Justice began hearings in a matter over alleged eviction of residents from the Mau Forest. The case, which was filed by Professor Kiprona, a governor in Kenya, who is suing the government of Kenya for unlawfully evicting thousands of residents from their homesteads. Kiprona further alleges that many residents were tortured, had their homes burnt down, and suffered loss of property without compensation. The government of Kenya contends that due process of law was followed to remove illegal encroachments into the forest to contain destruction, and no evictions were done on land adjacent to the forest as alleged. What are your thoughts on this one, Smu?
The failure of the Kenyan government to secure livelihoods by embarking on proper modernization is at the center of this, in my view. I mean, Kenya imports a lot of goods which could be manufactured locally for domestic consumption. I mean, from this, millions of workers could get employment. And because Kenya also serves the immediate region, the Central African region and the East African community. I mean, places like Somalia, Sudan, Uganda, and the eastern part of the DRC rely on Kenya because it's the most industrialized country in that region. So what you find is that through desperation, people use the only available resource that is the land. They use it for subsistence farming or survivalist hunting and gathering. I mean, settlements in the wetter parts of Kenya and the more rural parts of the country are sprawled over vast tracts of land. And this threatens the fragile ecosystem. The government of Kenya could have been proactive from the beginning to quell the haphazard land use. They would have been forced by this ruling. They will be forced to act accordingly, putting the welfare of their people as their top priority, and have an agenda to work towards industrialization, making sure that their people get jobs in this modern economy.
You know, the issue is that all African countries keep hearing the same story. At some point, we probably sound like broke records. We need to industrialize. We really need to. It's the only way to stabilize development, because Kenya has a lot of innovation, and there are a lot of green shoots that, you know, show the potential of the country, particularly in areas of technology and financial technology in particular, etc. But you know, without manufacturing, financial services and retail is not going to develop your people. Those are low income growth sectors, and they've got very little spillovers into other sectors. In fact, you know, what financial sector growth normally means is that other growth in other sectors is being hamstrung somehow, particularly the real economy. There's no solution without industrialization at the core of development for the continent.
Mhm.
On that note, that brings us to our second story in the Africa Regional Update: women's political participation in Somalia. Unresolved issues surrounding parliamentary quotas and women's participation in elections are crucial in efforts to achieve sustainable peace, economic resilience, and inclusive development in Somalia. The United Nations UN Deputy Secretary General DSG Amina Mohammed in the Security Council reported that a 30% quota is a crucial first step towards equal representation of women in all sectors of Somalian life. Somalia's political environment is not conducive to women, with many male leaders promoting male candidates through political networks and connections that their female counterparts lack. The UNDSG added that Somali women struggle to access financial support to run campaigns, which is compounded by violence and discrimination. In 2016, Somalia reached a milestone with nearly a quarter of its parliamentary seats occupied by women, but this is still short of the recommended quota. Sbu, you had a point to raise around the gender dynamics in Somalia.
Well, the Somali society is patriarchal, and some say it's on the extreme side. I mean, women in that country have suffered the most under violent conditions brought on by civil war, as is always the case. Um, Now, this development is welcome. Representation at a political level is a first step towards entangling that society of cultural biases. Somali women are a resilient lot. They have proved time and again that they can punch above their weight when given the chance. So this is, it should not only be about politics, it should extend to commerce, it should extend to other areas, into sports, into arts. They should just be set free, basically.
Definitely agree with you on that one. I have very little to add except to say, you know, I'm so saddened by the way in which our culture's kind of stagnated over the years, because I've always understood African culture to be very resilient and dynamic in many ways. It's just a pity that, you know, some parts of the continent have not confronted these toxic traditions and cultures that we still have, which is just outdated in today's world, really.
It is, yeah.
On that note, that brings us to our next story in the Africa Regional Update: the African Climate and Environment Focus. The Review of Forest and Landscape Restoration in Africa 2021 report found that the continent loses 3% of GDP annually due to degradation of forests, and that land restoration is essential. The research by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the African Union Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD, found that 65% of productive land is degraded, whilst 45% of Africa's land area is affected by desertification. Degraded forest landscapes intensify the effects of climate change and are a barrier to building resilient and prosperous communities, given that 60% of Africans depend on their land and their forests as a primary source of their livelihood. More needs to be done to return land to sustainable production, protect biodiversity, and shield livelihoods in the battle against climate change. Almost precisely what you were referring to in the story from Kenya, Sbu.
Yeah, I mean, Africa, well, now, whichever way we look at it, is the last frontier. The continent's biodiversity has to be treasured. And recently I read a survey, a UN survey, showing that 80% of Africa's youth is concerned about climate change and environmental degradation. This pleased me a lot because it is the youth of the continent that needs to take up the fight and protect the continent from the pillaging of its natural resources, which in most cases is by foreigners, and locals benefited very little from it. The Savannah Belt south of the Sahel, stretching from West Africa right through to the Horn of Africa, is facing the highest risk. Even South Africa, the Karoo is expanding, meaning that the north and the south are facing present and immediate danger through desertification. So internal displacement and the Islamization of urban centers are also on the increase as people are forced by climatic changes to move off the land. What compounds matters even more is that this affects also our water resources. So we need to protect the continent, and we need a wide-ranging eco-developmental plan which focuses on the climate, on agriculture, on forests, water, and our environmental biodiversity. So this is as the world is moving towards making sure that we green the planet. So Africa should not be left behind. We should, we should develop better. We should learn the lessons from the global north, from Asia, and we should do better.
On that note, it brings us to our last story in the Africa Regional Update. CDC Center to be launched in Kenya. The African Union AU, through the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC, is set to launch the Eastern Regional Co-ordination Center, the ERRC, in Kenya on 1 October 2021. The ERRC will serve as a hub for Africa CDC surveillance, preparedness, and emergency response activities, and coordinates regional public health initiatives by member states in consultation with the Africa CDC headquarters. There are 5 regional collaborating centers in Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Zambia, and Gabon. These centers have been operating, but some of them have not been officially launched. And on that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game. All right, Spoo, what is your guess? Today's number is 250,857. What do you think that's related to?
That number should be about employment, jobs, I think. I think we must have lost. I think we must have lost that number of jobs over the past quarter.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I don't know. My feelers for the economy is that it hasn't been that bad. The second quarter or the third quarter hasn't been that bad. So it's 253,857 tourists in June 2021. So in June 2021, a total of 732,000 travelers, arrivals, departures, and transits passed through South African ports. In May, this was 735,000. And so what you've seen is a slight decrease from the May number in terms of total travelers passing through SA ports. But there was a total of 253,857 foreign arrivals, which consisted of 39,000 same-day visitors and 213,000 overnight visitors, tourists effectively. And the breakdown of tourists by regions is as follows. 24,000 were from overseas, 150,000 from SADC, and 3,000 were from other African countries outside of SADC. And the countries of residence of 330 tourists was classified as unspecified. So yeah, there you have it. There's a slight decrease, but pretty stable numbers in terms of tourists. And what we see is actually an increase, strong increase actually, in the number of tourists from overseas coming into South Africa. So that to me, I guess, is a reflection that perhaps the second quarter of this year was not too bad. If we take tourism as a sort of yardstick for economic or business activity.
Yes, yes, yeah. And what impresses me even more is that you're saying the numbers for SADC, that's 100 and they are like 5 times more than the numbers from overseas, which
Yeah,
means that SADC, we should strengthen our ties with our neighbors. We should do much better with our neighbors, trade, people to people, which is why I'm such a. I think you know that xenophobia is one of my pet hates.
sure.
So I think our fortunes lie within the region. South
Definitely,
Africa, if we
definitely.
could integrate, yeah, if we could integrate better, we could double this economy in the next 5 years or 10 years at the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, it's interesting because it's actually mutually beneficial in that, yes, we receive a lot of visitors from SADC as a country, but actually a lot of the travelers traveling through South Africa, I guess, are coming to the rest of the continent as well. And I think almost two-thirds of the actual travelers transiting through South Africa during June weren't coming into South Africa, and we're actually going to other countries. As you can see, 200,000 overnight visitors were still remaining, which is just a third of the total of 700,000. So, yeah, so it's actually a mutually beneficial sector if we look at the number of people that go into the rest of Africa, whilst we also receive quite a significant portion of visitors from SADC ourselves as a country.
Uh-huh. 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 Yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week. And again, I just want to remind you, for those listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to stay up to date with our notifications. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to hit us with a like.